Well, good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to everyone. We have a record-breaking group of people here tonight. If anybody in the back of the room has difficulty hearing, please let us know. We want to include everybody. It's always a very special occasion here to introduce the Fritz Stern lecture. I can't think of a more special rendition of this lecture than the one that will be given by Professor Charles Taylor with the title Democratic Degeneration, 3 Easy Paths to Regression. This is the 14th annual Fritz Stern lecture, which we were able to present with very profound thanks to Henry Arnhold and to the C.H. Beck Verlag. We honor a scholar with this lecture series who is not only a preeminent historian and abiding presence in the field of modern German studies, but also a founding trustee and a very key presence for the American Academy. We owe Fritz Stern a very deep debt. It was to Stern to whom Academy founder Richard C. Holbrooke turned when seeking advice as a U.S. ambassador to Germany and when seeking a home for the future American Academy in Berlin. Stern's 1979 book, Gold and Iron, described Bismarck's banker, Gerson von Bleischröder. It was the Bleischröder family bank that was eventually subsumed into the Arnhold Bank in 1931, leading Holbrooke to the Arnholds in New York City, and with Fritz Stern's help to this house in which we are all assembled tonight. Holbrooke once said of Stern, quote, "He is one of Germany's greatest unintentional gifts to America, and he has in turn devoted his life to helping Americans and Germans understand Germany through close examination of its and his own past," end quote. Stern's intellectual focus was the 19th century origin of the National Socialist movement in Germany, as well as its socio-cultural characteristics. His many essays and lectures, published in several collections, use biography as a window through which to view the late 19th and the 20th centuries. These include portraits of Germans and German Jews, politicians and scientists from Walter Rathenau and Ernst Reuter to Max Planck, Albert Einstein, whom Stern met as a young man, and Fritz Haber, his own godfather. Stern was the recipient of numerous honors, including the Peace Prize of the German Book Trade, the German National Prize, the Leo Beck Medal, and the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany. He held a number of honorary degrees, including from Oxford and Princeton. His most famous book is possibly Gold and Iron, the Bismarck-Bleischröder story, but the book, in a way that remains not only in the imagination but in the everyday practice of so many of us, is his early book from the early 1960s, The Politics of Cultural Despair. If any of you were present at Jill Abramson's Stern lecture last year, she also held up this book as having been career-forming for her. And if we think of the implications of this idea of the politics of cultural despair, clearly the resonance to our own time is enormous. And in a way related to the lecture given here last week by our Bosch Fellow, who will be introducing Professor Taylor, and that is Dilip Gaukar, Director of the Center for Global Culture and Communication and the Center for Transcultural Studies, an independent scholarly research network concerned with global issues. Dilip Gaukar is a professor at Northwestern University, having studied in Bombay and in Tufts University, and having developed a focus on the intellectual tradition of rhetoric, both its ancient roots and its contemporary mutations. His lecture last week was called Populism and the Pursuit of Dignity, a really marvelous lecture where I think you can see the kind of intellectual and analytical trend that I'm discussing. We will follow with Dilip's introduction of Charles Taylor. We will have the lecture Then there'll be a short question and answer discussion, followed by an open question and answer period from the floor. I believe Dilip will assemble small groups of questions to try to include as many people as possible. And in this context, please develop your questions with a question mark at the end of it, and hopefully not too long after you begin. Please begin by telling us, again, as economically as possible, who you are. This is extremely valuable for all of us here, as well as for the people who will be watching on the video, who may actually experience you only from behind. So with that, and with great enthusiasm, first Dilip, and then Charles, and welcome.
How do you introduce a person who is so much more than some of his accomplishments, when those accomplishments are so numerous and so very consequential, both in the life of the mind and in the life of the city and citizens? Having tried many other strategies for introducing Charles on previous occasions, none very successful, I've reconciled myself to enumerating few accomplishments and leave the rest to the imagination of the audience to form an image of Charles, which will no doubt be modified as you hear him shortly in person. But I will, again, having failed so many times, try some other new trick at the end of it, so you'll bear with me. By the way, the Academy has given me 7 minutes to introduce Charles, which I think is pretty generous, given that Charles Taylor was given only 6 minutes for acceptance speech at Kyoto Prize. By that measure, how much money Kyoto Prize involves, for 6 minutes, his speaking fees are much greater than Obama. Okay. Charles graduated in 1952 from McGill University with a history major with a thesis on peasant revolts in England in 1381. And I've been working on, peasant revolts and things like that. So I was talking to him, and he said, "Oh, yeah, I did this as an undergraduate. So I'm trying to do it at a rather late age in my life." And after having completed his McGill University, undergraduate, he went to Balliol College on a Rhodes Scholarship and completed a second BA in 1955. And next year, in 1956, he was admitted to doctoral program in philosophy as a prize fellow at the All Souls College. In the next 5 years, that is till 1961, Charles did much else than completing his dissertation under Isaiah Berlin, which was published 3 years later in 1964 as Explanations of Behavior, a scathing criticism of what was then dominant behavioral paradigm in social sciences. When I say much else, the 5 years, he says I was playing hooky, which nobody can do this. So I'm going to end the introduction by talking about what he means by playing hooky for 5 years, okay? Charles returned to Montreal to teach at McGill in philosophy and political science in 1961. And for the next 2 decades, he went back and forth teaching at McGill and Oxford, especially holding Schischele Professorship in Social and Political Theory at All Souls College from 1976 to 81. He went back to McGill and taught and retired at 2002 and took only U.S. appointment at Northwestern University, that's our home university, my home university, as a university professor in law and philosophy from 2002 to 2006. He has held visiting professorships appointment all over the world, from Harvard, Princeton, and Berkeley, the usual IB suspects, to Schiller University in Jena, Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi. Starting with Explanation of Behavior in 1964, Taylor has published more than about 18 or 20 books, of which 3 books have had massive impact. I don't have time to talk about them, but I just want to identify. First is Hegel book in 1975, which had transformed the Hegel studies, including the Germans began to read Hegel in English for a change because of reading Charles's book on Hegel. Second is The Sources of the Self in 1992, which has been translated in many languages. and it is the one which is involved a critique of the disembedded self of modernity, and involves a very, very interesting and detailed critique about what the sources of self are, which go back way before modernity. The third one is The Secular Age, published in 2009, which completely transforms our understanding of secularism, that in fact secularism and modernity are not different twins, but in fact secularism and religion have a lot of deep connections, that in fact secularism has its origin in the Christian worldview itself. It's a very interesting theory, which, those are the three books which have significantly altered our understanding of sources of the self, Hegel and Secular Age. With Charles, fortunately, for a philosopher, he is very well known, well recognized, and well appreciated. He has received all sorts of awards, and among them, the 4 prizes which I want to identify. I've already told you about Kyoto. The other one is Templeton Prize in 2007. Kyoto was 1 year later, 2008. Kluge Prize, which he shared with his friend and intellectual interlocutor Habermas in 2015, and Berggruen Prize last year in 2016. So, and there are all kind of other honors he has received: Academy of Arts and Science, in honorary member of American Academy of Arts and Science, and various other things. But what I want to make it clear is, as far as prize money for a scholar is concerned, Charles Taylor has no rivals. Habermas is a distant second with 3 prizes as opposed to 4 prizes. Okay. Now to the public life. Charles has been active member of New Democratic Party in Canada. He ran as a candidate of his party in federal election on 3 occasions in the 1960s from a constituency called Mount Royal. In 1965 election, he lost the election to the newcomer and the future Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau. You can imagine what would have happened if you want to look for alternative scenarios if Charles had won and Pierre had lost. What would have happened to philosophy, what would have happened to poor Justin, and so on and so forth. But in any case, Pierre Trudeau's other son, Sacha, went on to study with Charles at McGill later on. Okay? So in 2007, and also he was asked in 2007, his public life continued. He was a chair of the co-chair of a commission on multiculturalism, that is how to accommodate differences in culture in a multicultural polity, which was organized in Quebec, and the paper that came out has been a model for other peoples to follow about how one might deal with the multicultural issue. But now I want to conclude, having given the routine kind of a thing, with what I would call 5 years in the life of young Taylor. Okay, 5 years between 1956 and 61, when he's told me he was playing hooky. Nobody can do this. At the end of 61, he published this, he completed his dissertation, Explanation of Behavior, which went on to be very influential. But during those 5 years, what was he doing in terms of playing hooky? One was intellectual in the sense that he was summoned by J.L. Austin one day to brief him and his, what he called J.L. Austin circle, and you ought to know what it is to be summoned by J.L. Austin in terms of speech acts. He had to do it, right? And he was asked to brief him because Taylor was sort of flirting with French philosophy. He said, tell us who this Merleau-Ponty character is. So that began Charles Taylor's bridge building between English ordinary language philosophy and analytical philosophy on one hand, and the continental philosophy on there. And he was also there at Roymont Conference in 1958, when you brought all these titans of Anglo-American philosophy and the French philosophy, and they had nothing much to say to each other. After that, Charles Taylor has been following, unlike his elders, so to speak, has been very friendly in trying to build a bridge between the two. He has been very close interlocutor with Habermas and also late Michel Foucault, and at the same time continuing to cultivate the analytical philosophers like Bernard Williams, Rawls, and Rorty, and so on. And this is one part he was doing in that 5 years, which shaped his. The second one was, it is less well known to many people, that he, along with Stuart Hall, cultural studies person, and Rolf Samuels and Gabriel Parsons started the New Left Review, including E.P. Thompson. 6 years later, they will all disappear in different races, but that was a kind of intellectual ferment with the New Left, which continues to today. And you can imagine a scene in which, as 1961, as he is leaving for Canada, he is giving advice to Perry Anderson about how to continue the tradition of New Left Review. You can imagine what kind of an intellectual scene that was. Finally, in addition to these two things, finally in 1956, all of us are talking about refugee issues and how it might be causing all kind of problems for United States, in Europe in terms of democracy and its future and so on. In 1956, Charles, of course, disappeared from Oxford and resurfaced in Vienna to take care of the issue of Hungarian refugees. And there were 150,000 refugees. He was in the help of processing that. So he is no stranger to the refugee issue, and we couldn't expect anyone better suited to talk about it today, about democracy and its degeneration, in relation, among other things, to issues about immigration, mass politics, populism, and so on. Here is Charles Taylor.
Great, that was wonderful. I hope that next time Dilip introduces me, he'll get 10 minutes and then... Yeah, but I have to say how pleased I am and how honored I am to be here. Michael Steinberg and also Dilip, we've been together before and had very, very interesting, illuminating discussions. And also how honored I am to be giving a lecture under the name of Fritz Stern. I've admired his work greatly and for a long time. And it's I feel lifted above my proper station by giving a lecture under his name. Well, this very pessimistic sounding title, I'm now going to try to explain. And in a way, I'm under some Gramscian slogan here, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, because I still, in spite of what I'm going to say, I still think we're in with a chance and we've got to fight. But the basic point I want to make at the beginning, the downer point, is that we've lived very often, and I've been guilty of this myself, with the idea that we're on an escalator in history, that democracy is coming, that now here, later there, and it's kind of inevitable progress. And I think this is just not true. Now, what really shows how untrue it is that our democracy, I think, contains, what is the word? Susceptibility. It's like a medical analogy, right? When somebody has in their makeup, either from genetic or the environment, a susceptibility to catch colds or to get this disease or whatever, or people in Delhi to have, obviously, asthma today. It's that kind of thing. It's susceptible to certain kinds of axes of degeneration. I want to talk about three, which we're actually seeing very much enacted today before us. And then turn at the end to, well, how can we, that's the optimism of the will, what can we do about this? Now, I'd like to start off saying some very obvious, widely known things about the history of the word democracy, because I want to draw from them certain approaches which will help me start my talk off. So, democracy, as you all know, it was only 200 years ago that it stopped being a swear word or a nasty word, right? That you go back to Aristotle, and for Aristotle, democracy was the unchecked or, as it were, uncontrolled power of the demos being the non-elites of the society over everyone else, including the elites, including people of aristocratic and moneyed position. Just as in the opposite end, oligarchy was the same kind of unchecked control by the rich and noble. So for Aristotle, the best society, as you know, was what he called politeia, was a kind of balance between the two, a kind of balance of power. And up till the 18th century, if you propose democracy, including the founders of the American Constitution, this is not what we want at all. They thought it too in terms of the kind of balance, which they call the republic. I mean, that's very interesting because republic translates, Plato's politeia, and republic also translates in that sense Aristotle's politeia. But democracy was really bad news, right? And then suddenly it becomes our word for the most desirable society. In other words, what previously was called a polity or a republic or whatever, defined against democracy, becomes our word for what we're fighting to make the world safe for, or what, is our highest praise. So I think we have to see in this a kind of shift in the meanings of the word. And there really get to be two important applications of it. One in which we can see actually in the double meaning of what we translate, the words we translate, demos by very often, people, peuple, folk, popolo, and so on, right? Always have a double meaning. They mean, on one hand, the whole population, which makes up the polity. They mean, on the other hand, what the Greeks call demos, the non-elites, right? In Roman terms, not the populus, but the plebs, not the laus, but the demos, right? And this double meaning, I think, translates the ambition behind the word democracy, that in the end, ideally, these two senses of the word people would fuse. That is, so there would be a society ruled by the whole people, but without elite relationship, which put some in the shade and made some disadvantaged. Now, so we have two ways of identifying democracy. We can say something is a democracy, some countries is a democracy because they have the rule of law, and they have elections in which all the people can participate, kind of Schumpeterian idea of democracy. And then we also have another judgment. Such and such a country, yeah, it's formally a democracy, but it's really not living fully a democratic mode of life, right? And in that second case, I think we have a concept, I want to call it a telic concept. It's a concept of what the ideal should be, but which we never fully attain. Or maybe we do for a short time, and then we slide away again. And I think that gives us the key to a very important dynamic in democracy, which is part of my first point, my first path of degeneration. There are periods when clearly we're moving towards democracy. I mean, for instance, periods of actual liberation from foreign rule or liberation from dictatorial rule, the kind of thing happened in '89 and in Eastern Europe, the kind of thing that happened after the Tahrir Square in the Arab Spring. There's a great sense of enthusiasm. We're moving in the right direction. And then there are periods of lower morale when we feel we're moving away. And if you look at the 200 years of what we now call democracy in the West, you see that there were movements. I mean, the Jacksonian Revolution was in a sense, democratic revolution against a class of elite, which mainly was powerful landed interests. Then you have, in the 19th century, powerful industrial interests, the Golden Age, the Gilded Age, the robber barons. And then you got in the 30s, and particularly after the Second World War, pushed back against that and the rise of welfare states, of social democracy, and so on. And then we've had, since about 1975, we've been sliding in the other direction. And it's this important feature of democratic encouragement, enthusiasm, moving forward, and democratic discouragement. Now, that brings me to my first, if you like, first kind of path of degeneration, that for a variety of reasons, democracies always have to remake their move towards the telic goal, right? And it may be because when you move, let's say, from the early 19th century to the late 19th century, because the sources of power have changed totally. Sources of power have changed from landed property to industrial to industrial power, to large corporations, and they change again. And finance has a tremendously important role now to play in the way we live our lives, or it may be simply because it's very, very hard to maintain democracy at the high tide of being close to its telos. But in any case, it's clear that we've had this slide backwards since, let's say, 1975. And this is translated, of course, in growing inequality. That's the fruit of it. But it's also the cause of it. See, that is really why I talk about slides, because there is a kind of spiraling here. The more people feel that they don't have a real power in relation to the elites, and their fate is being decided for them, whether there's going to be employment in their area or not, and so on and so on, the more they feel discouraged about their ability to influence this, the less they vote. So we've seen in this period I've been talking about a decline in the levels of participation in elections in just about all Western democracies. Some start from a higher and some start from a lower level, but the basic trend has been, generally speaking, down. But of course that abstention itself increases the power of money, of special interest, and so on. So the discouragement gets deeper. There's a danger, therefore, of a kind of spiraling downward. And there's various kinds of downward spirals, which I don't think I have time fully to go into in detail, where these movements feed on themselves. I mean, for instance, quickly to talk about some interesting facts about the kinds of abstention that are taking place. They're taking place much more in the West among poor than among rich. They're taking place much more among uneducated than educated. They're taking place much more under people with a sort of hand-to-mouth income as to people with steady income, much more among the young than the old, and much more among minorities than majorities, generally speaking, right? The interesting fact is that, to show the varied world of democracy, in many cases in India, it's the exact opposite of this, that there's higher participation among the uneducated than the educated, higher participation from the poor than the rich, and so on. Very interesting work has been done by people in the CSDS and Mukulika Banerjee and so on this. So we're talking about something here which is specific to the, if you like, we're talking about in India, let's hope it goes on, we're talking about a society which is in that other trajectory, the trajectory upward, the trajectory of enthusiasm, the trajectory of really believing in elections and on the part of precisely non-elites. But in our case, it's moving in the other direction. And what's really worrying about this is another kind of spiral, many spirals, but I don't want to try to go into all of them now, but another kind of spiral, the spiral of what you could call, well, cruelly speaking, dumbing down. That is, we understand, I mean, lots and lots and lots of people in our societies understand less about how things work, what's going to lead to what voting for X will produce as against voting for Y. They understand much less about these mechanisms than they did in the 30 glorious years, as the French say, 30 glorieuses, between 45 and 75, when we were building our welfare states and so on. That's partly because the society is a little bit less readable. If you have a big party of the left, big party of the right with general programs, you've got to know if you vote this way, there's going to be more welfare. If you vote that way, there's going to be less. And now there is a much more fragmentation with all of movements of various kinds, ecological, feminist, and so on, gay rights, etc. So it's less legible. But there's also something very fundamental about modern democracy as against ancient democracy, that there's a tendency for the thing not to be entirely legible at all, because if you, Greek democracy, the ecclesia meets, right? It's dominated by the demos. It votes to, I don't know, send people to massacre Mussolini, wherever it is, and that's it. And you may think it's a terrible thing that they did, but it's clearly the will of the demos, right? But in our rule of law, complex representative systems, it's often very hard to be sure whether the will of the people is being listened to or not. So intrinsically, there is a tendency for this to become more opaque as it becomes less open to the non-elites' participation. And at the same time, a lot of people don't vote, they turn off, and they're very unclear as to what is actually happening. And that means that they're open to various kinds of appeal, which more knowledgeable people think is totally magic thinking going on here, like I'm going to make America great again as an example, right? Exactly how. but that is another way in which the spiral can continue downwards. Okay, so that is one of the ways in which democracy is not inevitably, but it's, let's say, susceptible to a kind of degeneration, losing its nature, moving in this case away from the implicit telos, the implicit goal, right? And the reason why I say it's kind of a tendency is that there is a self-feeding. There tends to be a self-feeding nature to this process. Well, the second one I want to talk about is the one that we could call well, there isn't a generic term, but the move towards, or the power gained by various movements of exclusion. That is, movements that want to say certain members of the polis, certain members of the republic, are not really members of the republic. And this is another basic susceptibility which I think we need to look at more closely. Democracies, democratic republics really require a very powerful sense of common identity surrounding Americans, Canadians, Quebecois, Germans, French, and so on. Why? Well, because the very nature of democracy, for several reasons, requires this strong commitment. Requires this strong commitment because democracies require participation in voting, participation in paying taxes, or participation sometimes in going to war if there's conscription, and requires also very often redistribution. There has to be a very profound solidarity, right? Therefore, to motivate those modes of participation. So that requires a strong common identity. And finally, but very importantly also, if we're in a deliberative community together, right? We're talking together, deciding among ourselves, voting and making decisions, we have to trust the other members of the group, right? If you see a situation arises in which independentist movements start very easily, and I happen to know a case like that coming from Quebec. What sets off independentist movements is, well, when they're talking about the good society, they're not thinking of us. They're talking just about them, right? Or we don't get a look in, we're not part of their horizon. When that kind of trust breaks down, then democracy is in very big trouble. The republic is in big trouble, and it can even end up splitting into two, right? So, okay, we need this powerful identity. But now, these powerful identities can slip very easily in a negative and exclusionary direction. Well, how? A very good book by the Yale sociologist Jeff Alexander called, I think, the Civic Code, which he makes this point. The common properties which make up this identity are very strongly morally charged, right? They're good. And as a matter of fact, in most contemporary societies, democratic societies, there's two sides to the identity. It has a principled side that we believe in democracy, human rights, equality, but it also has a particular side. As a Canadian, I believe in this Canadian project, and also Quebec project, which I think are perfectly compatible. This particular project, Americans believe in the American project of realizing these values. This is what Habermas, I think, probably ought to have meant by constitutional patriotism. I think he probably did, right? Well, it's easy to develop a certain idea of what the moral stature is, which excludes various people. For instance, the famous speech or infamous speech by Romney in the last election, but one, right, which cost him the defeat at the hands of Obama, was the famous 47% remark, right? 47% of the people are just passengers, they're just asking to be given what they need, they're not really producing, see? What you have there is the implicit idea that the real American is productive, enterprising, self-reliant, going out there. So these people, they're not really Americans, right? So you get the justification from that for a lot of things that you see on the American right and which the Harper government in Canada tried out and we stopped them. Things like vote suppressing legislation. You know, you've got to have such and such an identity card, which a lot of people in certain categories don't have, otherwise you can't come to vote. How people can, I mean, this could be just a totally cynical move, but it's probably one that's justified by sense of the failure to live up to the moral requirements of citizenship that one perceives in these people. Or you can get another kind of exclusion where it's basically ethnic or historic, which is the criterion. No? The people who really belong to the ethnicity, and then there's other people who came along after. So there are people who've always been here, and then the immigrants came, or etc. And there you get the basically ethnic coding, but the same kind of slide can occur, you see, because we're all, okay, take Quebec, we sont tous des Québécois, right? Well, in one sense, there's a very powerful ethnic story behind that. You know, 70,000 French speakers were left on the banks of the St. Lawrence when the conquest went through in 1763, or the Treaty of Paris, and they've now built this magnificent, French-speaking society, 8 million, so on. So it's been a fight for survival. So there's a kind of easy way to slide from being Québécois, in the sense of being a Quebec citizen today, to being what we call Québécois de souche, I mean old stock Quebecer, right? You could easily slide into that, and it's exactly this commission that Deep was talking about when we had our task set to combat that kind of narrowing. But you can see, and in the United States there are even more stranger but horrifying notions of precedence. This very interesting book by Arlie Hochschild on strangers in their own land, where she kind of describes the mentality. There's a kind of order of precedence. You know, the natives come first, and the people who come from outside come second, and these liberal governments are helping all these people with second priority and not helping people with the first priority. See, that was a very powerful part of the Trump campaign. So you get this slide. Now, this slide is a catastrophe for various reasons. It's a catastrophe because it deeply divides and hampers and paralyzes, in a certain sense, the democratic society by dividing us into first and second-class citizens. But it also is a catastrophe in another way because it builds on the frustration caused by the first slide that I mentioned, that is the frustration where people feel that the system is stacked against them, that they can't really affect it, right? And that they want to do something about it, and that doing something about it would be to liberate the demos, or to give the demos power again against the elites. Only the demos has now been redescribed, you see, in this either moralistic or ethnic or historical precedence way, in a way which excludes, which has the double disadvantage that it deeply divides the society, and the second disadvantage, that it doesn't at all meet the actual problems of these people. It's not going to, I'll tell you a deep secret, Trump isn't going to make America great again. I'm sure that you had suspicions in your mind about this, and that he's not going to give all these people jobs again. So it's a kind of double catastrophe. But you can see how these two kinds of slide can be working, as it were, together, and be helping each other along. And the third one, really in a way follows from the second one, in this case, and the third real tragedy for a democracy is when it gets redefined as rule of the majority. That means that the people who are, as it were, voted against by the majority are not really part of the society anymore, and we don't want to consider the whole republic as a deliberative community which has to work it out, respect each other's opinion, listen to each other, find some solution. On the contrary, a certain segment of the people get ruled out. So in a certain way, you get two segments ruled out by this particular kind of populism: the rejected outsiders and the elites who are supposedly favoring them. Now, a word about the populism, because I want to talk about Dilip's very interesting article on this, which I think appeared in the magazine. I think that there are two kinds of populism in the end, represented by Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. In one way, populism has this sense that people are erupting into a system which is entirely run without considering them, or kind of breaking down the walls. They're breaking down the doors and disturbing the business as usual, more administratively defined action of government. But I think there's a very big difference between the Bernie and the Donald version, in that the Bernie version is truly universal. I mean, it's not excluding anyone. One may or may not agree with the particular policies put forward by Sanders. One may or may not be happy about this kind of populist eruption, but it was something which does not have the third, and I think absolutely fatal feature of the Donald Trump or the Marine Le Pen or the Geert Wilders and so on, versions which have this deeply divisive, as it were, dead-end feature. All right, so these three go together today. They don't necessarily always go together, but they go together today and they mutually reinforce each other today. And they're in each case something that democracy is susceptible to. It's susceptible to sliding towards elite rule, and then various mechanisms kick in that keep it going down. It's susceptible to this kind of, let's say, nativist, it's not always native, but this kind of nativist redefinition. And then there's a certain kind of self-feeding property about that situation also, because you get these tremendous hostilities which divide people, and it's very hard to get them back again. And it also easily lends itself to the kind of redefinition of democracy as pure majority rule. There is one massive majority will. It is being frustrated by these various figures of the elite and so on, and by outsiders they're helping. And what democracy means is to establish this. No discussion, no compromise, no respect for. It just rams through. And we get very close to the... Now, of course, we have already there the makings of what has helped to kill democracy off in various very fragile contexts. I'm thinking of Russia and Turkey as an example. Right? It's built on this idea of who the real Turks, real Russians are, and their culture, and in relation to orthodoxy, and not being for Western liberalism and homosexuality. So in the case of Russia, and in the case of Turkey, of course, it's built on rejecting any compromise with the Kurds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you get this kind of move can actually wreck democracy. It can wreck, but maybe we don't need to be totally paralyzed by that, because we're not very stable democracies to begin with, but you can see the tendency of it is in this direction. Now, I've lost track of the time. Somebody give me a...
It's 8:25. What time?
Yeah, so how long have I been talking?
How long do you have?
Yeah, well, I mean, I want to just say a few words now about what we might try to do about it. I mean, because it's a very, very big question. And, well, we also face a number of other problems which we're all aware of, which I haven't mentioned, which aggravate it, including a splitting up of media so that people are in echo chambers. The fact that the echo chamber effect is intensified by social media, the circulation, therefore, of total non-facts as facts, and people never have them in any way refuted, and so on, all of which makes our job all the harder. Okay. Well, what we obviously need to get out of this kind of situation in any given country is first of all, a program on the part of some party of reform or what have you. I mean, of the kind that Macron is trying to put together, but whether he succeeds or not, we'll see. A program which can draw on votes from both sides, from both those who've always been in a position of wanting certain reform in the society, to those who, while wanting similar reforms, have been taken off into this other identitarian path. Because people's identities are always complex. See? So that worker in the Rust Belt who may be very attracted to Pentecostal Christianity, may not be very great feminist and so on, and therefore in all sorts of ways is attracted by Trump's "I'm not politically correct," also would like some kind of job, right? Or some way of educating his kids in order to get that kind of job. So there is a way. Now you could even think of figures on the American scene, I won't go into it now, who might have managed to create that kind of coalition, because people have these complex identities. They're capable of entering into more than one coalition, right? And we need to rebuild coalitions crossing this boundary between these different groups. Once you do begin to build such a coalition, you begin to get a self-feeding process going in the right direction. Because people who never talk to each other, who see each other as strangers out there and very dangerous, as we tend to see the rednecks in West Virginia and so on, we liberals and so on, and as they see us, northeastern latte-sipping liberals and so on, that when you actually meet and work with people in the flesh, something very powerful happens. These senses of difference get dissolved, particularly if you have some kind of common project. Now, we've had a lot of proof of this on the small scale. The problem is how to upscale it. The various experiments on the small scale. Well, for instance, in certain associations in the great struggle in the States between pro-life, pro-choice, they bring people together for a weekend from both sides. And then they talk with each other. And then they find that they're not, 150 miles from each other. There's some kind of common ground, but also they don't find that they're a monster, the other one's a monster. Things begin to thaw. We did the same thing when we had really big constitutional problems in Canada. Again, at small scale, people were brought together for a weekend in Quebecois and Ontario and BC, etc., and they sat down and talked. And there again, all these great fears and so on were disappeared. And secondly, if you're working together on something, common project, that strengthens it. And also, you find here that you not only are breaking down the barriers, but you're also upping the democratic intelligence. I mean, the dumbing down effect is countered by the fact that you're trying to work out common projects and actually confronting the difficulties and how things have to be changed and what the levers are. And there are various attempts on the small scale to do this, three of which I recommend you looking up. One is what is a Saul Alinsky type organization, a man called Luke Bretherton. I'll give you this, anybody written a book on this in which he shows how they worked in London in a very interesting way. There's another kind of community organization in the States that sends out people, but there they meet people who already formed a group who are leaders in the community and want to know how somehow to get out of a terrible past in the community. Full disclosure, my niece is involved in this, and she's now advising a community, and she's in the States, she's in Boston, but she's advising a community in northern Wisconsin, precisely who voted for Trump because they're part of the Rust Belt and so on. But they want to find a way out. And then there is Patricia Nance, who should have been here tonight, who invited me to the IASS. She and Klaus Leggevi, when she was at the Kulturwissenschaft Institute in Essen, had this very interesting book, Die Konsultative. I think it's going to be translated into English, in which various cases where there was a large project from government and people were not sure they wanted to go along with that, but didn't know what to do about it, they brought together a representative sample who just were willing to talk about it, exchange. And they came up, after a while, with very interesting alternative solutions. I mean, that's why it's called the Alternative. So there are various attempts on the micro scale, and the micro scale is not sufficient, obviously, but it's a very important part of the whole movement. Earlier I was talking about the macro scale of large coalitions, but these large coalitions are successful to some extent in relation to the number of communities in which this kind of close community work has been done. And people, the realism, I mean, the understanding of what the levers are, what they want from the federal government, what they want from the state or provincial government and so on, gets clarified and becomes part of a consensus. And that's something which really empowers a larger movement. Now, I'm running out of time, and I'm in one way relieved because I don't have the larger answers about recreating this larger movement. Well, I feel I have sort of in my own society, but it's not a exportable solution either, because you have to, I mean, one of the things you have to be able to do, which I think we really did in our commission, is you have to understand exactly why people are taking this nativist turn, right? What the fears are, what the feelings are. You have to and if you've got to get out of your mind the epithets of redneck and backward and so on, which we too often simply hurl, and try to understand it. And then you have maybe the way to organize a movement which can hook the complex identities of those people too into a common movement, because they are complex identities. I mean, Quebec, for instance, we had this very bad program by the Parti Québécois, which wanted to deny people the right to wear the hijab, etc. And the polls were set out, and 50-something% of the population was in agreement. But then somebody asked another question. Would you really agree that people could be fired on the basis of this wearing? 50-something% no, right? So you see, so complex, people are complex, and if and fortunately the opposition to the Parti Québécois were hammering this point, how many, combien de congédiements. So that's something you absolutely need to do, so, I mean, it's a difficult and long haul, but that's why I say I'm not a pessimist. In spite of all these spirals, there are counter spirals that are out there waiting to be created. And so, but maybe I should stop now and we can have a question period. Thank you very, very much.
The floor is open. We are going to take about 3 questions at a time. Hopefully they will have some semblance of similarity. So we'll start with 1, 2, okay, and 3. Well, yeah. Yeah, you
Do I need a
please.
mic or?
Yeah.
Can I just-
Oh, yeah.
The mic is coming.
Mike is coming.
Thanks very much for an extremely interesting talk. And I share your lack of pessimism. I don't like the word optimism because hope is different from optimism, it seems to me. I think this kind of work can only take place in small groups, and I've seen it work in a number of different places. So that was just a comment. My question is the following. I am having increasing trouble understanding the concept of populism since people used it to describe both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. My understanding of populism had been the use of claims that are appealing but basically not true. in order to, win voters or win people to the cause. And as far as I've been able to determine, nobody's really accused Sanders of a serious untruth, whereas, people count the numbers of lies that the man in the White House has managed to utter. So maybe I'm missing something from a partisan perspective, but I'm very curious about how you're using the word populism and how you define it, given that you made a distinction between the two of them. Mm-hmm. But as far as I could, I didn't quite get the conceptual distinction.
Mm-hmm. Second question.
I wanted to question your first thesis that people lack a kind of, they perceive a lack of influence, of political or social influence. Well, we see two things, that we have social media, which are more influential than ever in the world and caused already big upheavals, for example, in Saudi and in the Islamic states. But on the other side I know, or I believe, or I heard, that in the far-right movements in the world are much better organized and are much more self-conscious of their social influence than the liberal part of the society is. So I don't believe that your first thesis is, it seems a bit counterfactual. I think the nativist movement knows much better than the other side of society how to be influential. So it seems not to me very plausible that this is one of the strong motivations of resisting the given or political order.
Okay. The one in the back there.
Thank you very much, Professor Taylor. In last week's Economist, there was an economist quoted saying in 1971 that a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention. Would you be positive or negative, rather optimistic or pessimistic, on the vision that Western societies might be able, speaking of Western societies, meaning politicians, meaning scholars, meaning entrepreneurs, will be able to establish systems in the next decades in which people will be able to deal with an overflow of information in respect to education and lifelong learning? Thank you.
Yeah, but I think it's not really, it's only an overflow of information if you don't have a sense of what you're looking for, what's relevant. The more you have people focused together on, let's say, trying to solve some problem together, the more attention is going to be focused, and not every bit of information in the universe is going to be relevant. But if you're just looking like that to the television and seeing or reading, it's true, you can get really bedazzled. But you see that these things all go together, having a project and then believing that you can get the project through, right? These are very, very tightly tied together. So I come to your point, yeah. Well, this is a thesis, my thesis is double. I mean, one is how people feel, and the other is whether they actually are influential. But it's the how people feel that I find is important. If what you say is right, how is it that the slogan, yes, we can, has this galvanizing effect? How is it that one of the major parties emerging from the Spanish indignados is Podemos? Yes, we can. There's a very powerful sense of, I'm in the Rust Belt, I can't get a job, I can't get my kid educated, no one gives a damn up there, I'd like to be able to do something, but you can't. And the various reasons why you believe you can't, they're all crooked, or the system. And then somebody comes along like Obama and says, yes, we can, and it galvanizes lots of people. And that, I think, is the crucial fact, that the dissatisfaction of objective conditions, plus the dissatisfaction of felt impotence, plus this very simplistic and attractive to the, anyway, the identity side of you appeal, I'll do it, just, you know, these other people are stopping you from getting that, see? All that bespeaks this sense of impotence. That's a very, very important part of the chemical mix that allows all these demagogues to get so far. Now, so I'm just making a, you know, a purely, if you like, semantic point, that there are certain similarities between these two revolts in that they claim there's a sort of elite operation going on here, totally ignoring the people, and they claim to speak for the demos. But there's a reason why I think there's a tremendous difference, is that in one case, it is a very divisive and ultimately dead-end appeal. So if one continues with the idea that populism is a swear word, then of course I don't apply it to Bernie at all. But there are analogies between the way that they burst in the name of the people and so on. So, I mean, I don't care how this falls out, but if you take my broader concept, then it isn't automatically a negative term. See?
Go ahead.
Hey, thank you for the talk. I'm going to follow instructions and say I'm Dean Moyer, professor of philosophy at Johns Hopkins, and reading at the Ethics of Authenticity in 1992 is probably why I became a Hegel scholar, and I'm a former fellow here as well. So my question, I guess, is sort of about Hegel, which is there something that could take the place of what he called in his time where the corporations mean something quite a bit different than it does now, this kind of mediating element between the idea that, okay, the people as a whole, everybody gets to vote. No, we have to sort of vote according to our interests, which are channeled through our kind of profession. So I'm just wondering, do you see a kind of role for labor, I guess, labor unions, something else that would play the role that the corporations played then that would somehow, prevent us from having these pathologies that come with kind of completely disorganized voting procedure?
Yeah, I mean, I do very much think that the decline in the level of unionization in the United States has been one of the things that has opened the way for kind of elite rule. So we definitely need a bigger tissue of social organization. And what I said, I think to the agreement of some a little while ago, that an important part of what we're going to have to rebuild is going to be local community organizations. So that's a different kind of thing from a countrywide trade union. I'm a bit made nervous by invoking the name of Hegel for this, because it was all tied so beautifully together, that the messiness, the conflictuality, and so on was kind of painted out of the picture. And that messiness and conflictuality is there to stay. I mean, can we override that with a sense of common citizenship? This is the great secret of democracy. The 18th century British invented this, the idea of His Majesty's loyal opposition, which to many of the regimes in Europe, like the French, can't do it. Red, green, blue, I mean, round squares, it's ridiculous. That concept that we are bonded by something more is something we have to be able to recover, but it'll never be neatly tied together like.
Jackie?
Oh, I should.
That's what I'm going to take.
I should wait for three, right? Yeah, I should wait for three questions.
No, that's okay.
In mentioning the role that local deliberation and local communities can play, in your view, in healing the rifts in society, will those local deliberations address the extent to which globalization enters into the conflicts that exist in our society. So to the extent that local communities might decide they don't want outsiders, or they don't feel an obligation to outsiders coming into that society, is that kind of local deliberation going to address the conflicts about what the size of the polity of the demos should be, and whom the demos should include, and whether the demos should include people, newcomers, outsiders? Are the problems of globalization going to be addressed by closer micro cooperation at the local level?
I've got to obey instructions that allow.
No, I think we are right now. Here.
Yeah.
It's a related question, and that is, I would love to hear you say a little bit more about the complicated identities that you spoke about, because I think we're used to assuming that the notion of a complicated identity reflects some kind of cosmopolitanism or internationalism or a sense of the other, and on the other hand, that the desire for a simple life, simple identity, authenticity that becomes exclusionary, in fact, is a denial of the legitimacy of a complicated identity. So I'm curious about your usage of that.
No. Okay, I'll go backwards again, because everybody has a complex identity. See, because they're also a mother, a father, a daughter, a son, a husband. They're interested in hockey or not hockey. There's just, as well as being whatever ethnic or whatever the community, like Québécois de souche, agrees on, there are all these other things. And they also have different friends, they've met different people and it's marked them in different ways. So, what we found in Quebec is that the most effective way to overcome the exclusionary relation by attitude, Québécois de souche, is to bring them in contact with others. And then the sort of terrible image they have disappears and dissipates, so that without ceasing to be, in a certain important sense, with participating in the Québécois de souche identity, they have all these other factors. So the friends you have, the activities you're in, the role you play in a family, the kind of life experiences, all that makes even the most, centrally located member of this identity different from others. And in this way you can appeal to something in what they are. If you have the level of there's really two questions there. If you have at the level of the town the same kind of exclusionary takeover, in the southwest France where the mayor belongs to the Front National, then my whole point goes. But if you have, for instance, what we experience in Quebec very much, in municipalities like Montreal, there's a very strong sense that you've got to serve everybody. Everybody's got to be taken care of, right? And so at that point, you have people like the mayor of Montreal is really, important figure standing for that kind of openness. It's something that the idea that, you see, it's all very well if they're way the hell over there. I think it's the same in the States. If they're way over in New York, you can hate them and so on. But if they're living next door, and when the house burns down, you ask them, or when you want somebody to watch the dog and so on, and you ask them over, then this kind of thing doesn't happen. Now, on the other hand, that's only deciding the manner and degree of trade globalization is something which is going to happen in Ottawa, right? So the way in which communities here can make a difference is they can be much clearer in what they need in the way of policy at that level, and therefore have some influence. But it's not the level in which you can resolve the policy questions up here.
Thank you. You've talked a lot about community level action, but can you speak a little bit about incentives at the sort of higher national political level? What fuels separatist policy making or political system? For example, in India, there are politicians in every state that are winning on the basis of exclusionist policies, anti-Muslim policies, anti-Christian policies. Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, these are all politicians at the national level that are gaining success by supporting exclusionary politics. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, this is, sorry. Rule, okay. I'll wait for the next question.
My question is to the more optimistic proposal you make. I have the suspicion that deliberation is an elite project. And we investigated in the Wissenschaftszentrum in Berlin many of these consensus conferences and discourses and local initiatives and social movements. And in the end, it turned out that this is very dissociated from the masses. And the question is the rationalism of deliberation the solution, or is redistribution the solution? So to integrate those who do not participate in this deliberative world, they have to rely. Then you have to rely on the output of the political system, which of course means that you cannot be optimistic really to include all these people who are susceptible to these emotions and this identity rhetoric.
Yeah.
Okay, you can answer.
Well, I mean, I thought I had already answered that question. That's my problem. That you can't just divide the world simply into people who are moved by exclusionary sentiments and people that are moved by other sentiments. There are a tremendous number of people who are moved by more than one sentiment, right? That's what I mean by complex identities. We make life more difficult for ourselves by assuming that all the people now voting for Trump couldn't be won over to vote for, couldn't have been won by Joe Biden, or couldn't. That's not the way it is in the universe. It's just there are not people in these neat. Of course, there are people that are really so into it that they won't consider any kind of change. That's certainly true. But we have really to try to get together all these different people with very different identities in order to see whether we can't defeat those people. And in many cases we can. And so now, sure, examples of Hungary and Poland, yeah. Well, there we have examples of democracies which are heading towards failure. I mean, the failure to generate more. Now, I'm less pessimistic about Poland because there still is a very powerful political movement which is now out of office, but Kaczynski and his guys are making lots of mistakes, fortunately, and so they might be defeated. I'm very pessimistic about Hungary because Orban has stacked the constitution in the most incredible way. It makes it very difficult to envisage his ever being defeated. The Czech Republic is another matter. I mean, the Czech Republic, again, there are forces there that are more open, and the Czech Republic is very much up for, the thing is up for play there. The game isn't over.
Cathy, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. Cathy Martin, thank you for your wonderful, inspirational remarks. Do you, from your perspective, does the fraying of the fabric of American society need to further deteriorate before? In other words, do the people who believe that Trump will make America great again need to feel pain before we can begin the process of regeneration? Or can we start that process now?
Well, I would hope not. We don't. I mean, there are certain steps being taken already that may succeed, for instance, in turning over one or both houses of Congress in 2018, and that would already be, a beginning. I mean, the chances of their actually passing one of these crazy, contradictory, insane bills that they keep, ending Obamacare but pretending it's going to make everybody have more health care. They throw in, they're going to cancel the individual mandate in the middle of an attempt to relieve taxes on multi-billionaires. One of these days, if they go on like this, they get another 3 years, they might pass one of these things, and then it would be a real disaster. So it is to be hoped that at least one house will be turned over in 2018. And then we can, but I mean, we've got to start organizing. If I were an American, I would be out there organizing for that the whole time. And I hope that there are Americans who are organizing for that.
There are two questions in the back there.
Yeah, you mentioned Ali Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, what about the role of institutions, of the party system, and also of the state governments? I think one of the striking features of Hochschild's book was the impact of the Republican state government on the local level, on the lives of the individuals that who feel that they have lost control.
Yeah.
And I think this is the state level and the impact of state governments on the population is very rarely considered.
Yeah, I think it's terrible, and I think that in the American system, the Republicans have been given a chance to govern too many states, right? And that's partly because a lot of people who are very disadvantaged by that do not vote. The level of voting is lower, but the things I read out earlier about the older you are, the richer you are, and so on, voting, right, mean that skewed vote can mean that even a population in a majority is very disadvantaged by Bobby Jindal. As it were, more or less abolishing the civil service in order to give rebates to the oil industry. They don't. A lot of them don't vote. So there again, a whole lot of grassroots organization could really change American politics. This is made worse by the American Constitution, which gives the power to determine the law in federal elections to the states. This is a really crazy idea. I mean, no other democracy I know does that.
Charles, I'm going to exercise the privilege of the chair and ask a question.
Oh, great.
And then if I might try to put your meditations on the fate of democracy and its present travails in your larger work, that is, you have spent a large portion of your intellectual energy critiquing the kind of a slow erosion of the moral order, especially in the West, from sources of the self to the secular age, and in offering a kind of a friendly critique of Enlightenment project, of which democracy is one. Mm-hmm. So to what extent do you sense that current travail and the decline of democratic solidarity at the national level or at another level is in many ways related to this slow erosion of the moral order, whereas in fact one could really sustain a democratic project in the absence of some kind of shared moral order, which does not seem to surface at all in the contemporary discourse about the problems we're facing today.
Yeah. No, I think definitely that these kind of movements only work by recreating a certain sense of solidarity, common goals, and therefore something more valuable than just me, just mine. So where that is, one of the reasons why that has been eroded has been by another facet of the Enlightenment, that is the belief in there being automatic mechanisms, particularly economic mechanisms. I mean, this is the whole point about neoliberalism, markets will somehow solve the whole thing, right? If markets could solve the whole thing, then of course we don't need to have moral, decisions or moral deep pondering about where are we going, are we being fair to these people or those people, it will all be solved. And this is this is the illusory side. I mean, the Enlightenment is a complex thing, right? It has this illusory side, the oversimplistic notion of automatic mechanisms and so on. And then it has this deeper side. I mean, I've always thought, I mean, in relation to my work, I thought that this is one sentence. The 18th century Enlightenment needs to be complemented by the Romantic movement. Then you get something like the, proper, full Enlightenment that we, but left as, this put these structures in place and it'll all work. It's deeply illusory.
We have one question in the back.
You started out by quoting Aristotle, and your idea of the spiral and the self-fulfilling prophecy reminded me of the one of the basic concepts of ancient political philosophy, that there is an inherent tendency to degenerate in the sort of basic forms of the constitution. So that once you have a democracy, it will degenerate, and an aristocracy also has a tendency to degenerate. While you call yourself an optimist and ask us to try to see the world situation in an optimistic way, I also had the impression that sort of your basic counsel could be put in the way to wait for the next turn of the cycle. So to wait for some automatic movement in another direction. And as I had always understood that sort of one of the steps forward which the modern age took in comparison with antiquity was to get beyond this idea of an inherent tendencies of quasi-cosmological processes working themselves out. My question to you would be whether the idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy isn't in danger of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy itself.
Okay, I have to digest that last sentence.
You can make your answer short, because the next turn is wine and dessert.
So in that case, the answer is no. What was the question?